Hello again, this is Luke Bergdorf with episode 8. I'm here with retired Chief Cudaback. Chief Cudaback, if you would just kind of introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yep, Brian Cudaback, ID number 169, hired on October 12th of 81 and retired on January 4th of 2017, 35 years and about 3 months.
Did you grow up in Arlington? Or?
No, I didn't. I actually told myself when I was young, I knew I wanted to be a firefighter when I was real young, and when I started being able to test, I said, the first department that gets me forever. And just so happened, the fourth test I took was Arlington, and they took me first, so I stayed here forever. Yep.
What drew you to the fire service?
My dad was a volunteer firefighter in Nebraska, which is where I was born, and I was just always drawn to that. I'm definitely a child of the emergency show when it aired, and I remember laying on the floor in our house and watching that with Dad, and I remember saying, I think I was 11 when that came on, and saying that that's what I'm going to do for a living. And the day I turned 16, I joined the Keller Volunteer Fire Department as a junior, and that even facilitated it even more. Went to ECA school, went to EMT school, went to paramedic school in high school in Keller. They had a night program at a lot of people know it as TCOM, but it's now North Texas Medical School over there in Fort Worth. And so me and a couple friends that were volunteers in Keller went to paramedic school at night. And by the time I got out of high school, I was a paramedic, and I knew that's what I was going to do the rest of my life. So,
how old were you when you got hired in Arlington?
Interesting story. So I tested for Plano first. I tested Carrollton second, tested for Fort Worth third, and Arlington fourth. Every time I went in to take the Arlington test, we went to Vandergrift. I walked in, I showed them my license, took the written test. When I went to do the physical ability at the old training center on Sanford, I showed them my license. I actually got hired got told I got hired in October of 80. And after I graduated high school and right before Christmas, I'll never forget it, I came home one night and my dad just looked like somebody had died. And he said that Chief Moorhead had called, who was he was Captain Moorhead at the time. He was captain over training. Captain Moorhead had called him, and they found out that I was only 18 years old and you had to be 19, and they couldn't hire me. And so again, I didn't do anything. I showed him my license, just nobody ever caught it. But Captain Moorhead was really nice. He said the department decided to keep me. I'd made number one on the list. So he said that the department decided to keep me number one on the list until, back up. So we were supposed to go to work January 5th of 1981. That was Chief Riley's class, Robert Townley's class, all those guys. And he said they were going to keep me number one on the list, and they were going to hire again in October. So they did keep me number one on the list, or kept me on the list, and I hired on October 12th of 81 then. So it was real lucky to be able to still get hired on.
Mm-hmm.
But thankful for that.
Who were the guys that you hired on with?
I hired on with Rick Vincent, Rick Mahan, Ronnie Snow, Mark Campbell, Jamie Johnson, Charlie Robinson. There was 10 of us. I'm sure I forgot a couple. Rick Mahan, I may have mentioned him, but anyway, yeah, that was my group, just 10 guys.
You were a paramedic when you got hired?
Yep, I was a paramedic. I think the only other EMS guy in there was David Ojeski. He was in our class. I think he was an EMT. And so that's when, we actually got hired by Chief Martin, but then Chief Strickland came in before we got out of rookie school. So all of our guys in our class, I believe, were the first class that had to do EMT school. So David and I helped with that and ran errands when we came to the EMS part. And yeah, so.
Did you have any interactions with Chief Martin?
You know what? No, I didn't. I met the guy once personally when, again, we first got hired on. I think he came out to training or something. I can't even remember, but that was the one and only time.
Mm-hmm.
I actually think that even when we got hired, I want to say that he was already like either on his way out or had already retired, but came back. I can't remember all that, but yeah, at the time, Chief Shanklin was the interim assistant chief. I think Chief McFadden was the interim chief at the time, and yeah, it was a different time. So I
Mm-hmm.
was telling somebody the other day, I actually technically worked for 4 fire chiefs, including Chief Krause in the department. So
How about that?
yeah,
It's funny. I think there's only been like 7 paid fire chiefs in our
yeah,
history, so
yep. And 4 of them were the last 30, 40 years. So
they each have a long. They usually stay pretty long
yep,
when they get in that position. But
yep.
what was kind of your that process like getting hired on, getting that in your training?
Ours was, I look back, obviously, when I was 505, I got to watch every day those guys going through school. Ours wasn't as regimented, but it was obviously covering the same stuff. That old training center on Sanford was like no air conditioning, 1-room building. We'd run at lunchtime and we'd come back all sweaty, didn't take showers. It was, it was fun. It was different, but we learned all the same stuff. It was just as intense, and felt like we got, at the time, for that time in the world, we got the training that we needed to come out and be Arlington firefighters for sure.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the guys in the class, like Mark Campbell, was not a firefighter at the time, so we had a lot of guys that had no idea what that was about. They were looking for jobs and got it, but anyway, we had a good time for sure.
So you get through the training process and you go to your first shift, your first assignment. Where was that at?
Yep, my first assignment was one on A shift, and I'll admit it, I kind of sucked my way into that position. We did during rookie school, we did a couple of training deals with ones, and Captain Coker kind of latched on to me. He was a lieutenant there at ones, and I just flat asked him, man, I'd really like to come to ones. I wanted to be where the action was, if that was all possible. And sure enough, that's where I got assigned. Lieutenant Coker, Captain Hubbard at the time, Bob Franklin was a driver, Ray Hollis was a driver, Marty Englehart was firefighter, Gary U.S. Jones was a firefighter who I learned a lot from, and just a great guy, and just had a great time. And from there, the rest is history. But I can still remember walking in the back door. That's where we got told to report to, was ones, on our very first day. So it just so happened that the first day we started was an A shift. So we came in, I sat down at the table. I was obviously way early than everybody else because I was living in Keller. I didn't want to be late first day. And I sat there next to Ray Hollis, who ended up being my driver. But of course, he grilled me. If anybody ever knows Ray Hollis, he pretty opinionated and grilled me about who I was, where I was coming from, what made me think I'd be an Arlington firefighter. And the rest of the guys showed up. We went to human resources, signed all of our papers for insurance and whatever else. And, the rest is history. So.
Do you remember your first fire? You remember any calls for that?
Yeah, I do remember my first fire. My first fire was actually a dumpster fire, and didn't happen until 4 shifts after I hired on. We had a whole lot of false alarms. At that time, we had the mid-mount aerial, old LaFrance, and they put the rookies on the ladder truck because we didn't do much. I didn't. So went on a whole bunch of box alarms that ended up being nothing. But actually, my first official fire was a dumpster fire. So not very exciting. Yeah. And that was even before we did EMS. So we didn't go on a lot of EMS calls. Obviously, because I was a paramedic, and I want to think back, I think I was one of 4 paramedics on the department at the time, including Chief Bronner, Mark Stockton, Randy Ingram. So even though we weren't doing official EMS, they kind of leaned on us because we were, a little bit higher education EMS wise than everybody else. So, but that just wasn't part of our day like it is now, EMS, right? We're doing a lot of automatic alarms and stuff like that. So.
Did you have a probationary period?
Yeah, we did. But back then it wasn't much to it, right? Yeah. Just keep your nose straight, come in on time, and all that type stuff. And I want to say we got evaluated every month. I can't exactly remember that, but it wasn't much to it. And you were really going to have to mess up to lose your job at that time. So, but none of us messed up.
Yes, sir. How long were you at 1A for?
I was at 1A until they moved me to 8s, and I can't remember what that reason was, but shortly after I got to move to Eights, I wasn't there very long. I had taken the driver's test and I was going to make driver. So got promoted officially out of Eights to driver, I think right at 2 years of being a firefighter. So I wasn't a firefighter very long before I got promoted. Got sent to back to ones after that on a different shift, and was the driver. And then in 1984, they opened Station 11, and I got transferred to 11s. With Bill Villars was lieutenant. David Carroll was a firefighter, and can't remember the name of the other firefighter, but yeah.
So you opened up Station
Yep,
11?
opened up Station 11. Yeah.
What was that district like whenever it opened up?
You know, they didn't want us there. That station obviously is in the middle of a neighborhood, and they thought that we were going to be disruptive. So there's, we never experienced that animosity, but we were being told that there was a lot of animosity there, and to just watch our P's and Q's. That's why that was one of the first stations to have an on and off switch to the external speaker, because they didn't want to bother the community. We were always told in the morning, don't check out the siren and stuff like that. But again, we didn't have neighbors running by with rolling down their window going, get out of our neighborhood or anything like that. We never felt that way. It was told to us, but I'm not positive it was factual. But it was great opening up the station. The only thing about it was at that time, they had bought the 84 Suffin pumper for Station 11, and at the last minute decided to give it to ones. So we had to ride around in, our first assigned engine was old engine 3, one of the 68 convertible of France's. And so that was like, God dang. So we made it our own. We waxed it up and hadn't been taken care of and was on its way out and stuff. But an interesting fact about 11s too and us was we were on duty when Sherry Park burned, the big Sherry Park. Sherry Park's burned several times, and that's the apartment complex next to Twos over there, just north of Twos. But we were the only Arlington engine that did not make that fire that night. And we actually got, I want to say it was close to midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, we got bumped out to move up to 8s. And so as we're coming down Stadium, we can look right over Six Flags and we could see it, and about that time they'd said, I think it was a 5th alarm, whatever it was. And I told David Carroll, he was driving me, I said, make a left on Lamar, we'll go hit 360 and we'll be there. And they called all Fort Worth companies and they told us to continue to 8. So we slept at 8s all night, and we were the only ones that didn't make the fire at all. So yeah. Pretty depressing.
Yeah.
That was pretty much our career up there at 11s at the time.
How long were you at Station 11?
I was at 11s until I came back to ones on New Year's Day or the day after New Year's Day. What was that, 85 or 86? Man, I can't exactly remember then what that was, but I came to C Shift. Lieutenant David Crimmins, Captain Leonard Pittman. Man, I know Mark Campbell was there, but I think he was in that old 505 position we had that was kind of like a chief's aide. But yeah, went back to ones, and so I've been back and forth to ones several times. I actually left ones in 1989. I was next on the lieutenant's list, so they sent me out of class to Station 3 for a year. And what was depressing about that is there was actually a lieutenant's slot open, but they were evaluating whether or not they needed the lieutenant's position in training. So I ended up dying on the list. And in 90 went to 9s back as a driver. So on South Side, again, at the time we had a pretty big animosity about North and South Siders, and 9 was kind of depressing to go to as a driver. But again, went there. Leonard Pittman had transferred out there. Wayne Wilkins was my lieutenant. Mike Stump Lowe was the other driver, which I'd worked with at ones. He was the other driver I was trying to think about when we worked with Crimmins at ones. But you know what? We had a blast of a time out there at 9s, and that's when Cooper was 4 lanes, no median. Hypermart had just opened, and just a different time. But yeah, had a
Why was
blast.
there animosity between the north side?
It wasn't
and the south
wasn't
side?
animosity. It was the joke of, oh, you're a South Sider, you guys don't do much or whatever.
Yeah.
It was just a lot. None of it was true. Everybody worked hard, but it was just that North Side versus South Side deal. And again, one of those myths that probably didn't hold anything, but there's a stigmatism,
It's a friendly rivalry.
Right,
thing.
exactly. I'm going to the South Side. I'm not going to do anything. But Nines ended up being a pretty busy station. We made a lot of working fires, and it was a good time. Had a good crew. David Pivoto was a driver. Eventually came out and was a driver there. He's a good friend. Mark Campbell was there. Scott Bailey, who left, who ended up leaving early from the department to go do other things. David Jasper was there. We just had a blast. We're the ones that helped build the volleyball net out behind Nine, so we played volleyball all night. It was just a great time. That's back when we could do extracurricular stuff. But, yep.
And you were a driver then?
Yep, I was a driver there. I didn't try as hard to make lieutenant. Driver is still the best job in the fire department. I think my record is I died on 10 lieutenants lists.
Oh, wow.
I just didn't have any motivation to make lieutenant. So I didn't do good. I loved driving. I loved everything about fire trucks, obviously, from my working with you on history on trucks and stuff, and then what I'm doing now. It was just hard not to be a driver. But finally, I got sick of it. I asked for a transfer out of Nines in '96, and I went to eights. And the only reason I went to eights is because even though the guys were great, I didn't have a personal relationship with any of them. And I wanted to go to a station where I could study and not. We played a lot of cards. That was back when Nintendo came out at Nines, and we were all in the back trying to get to the next level, and there was just no time to study because I didn't make time to study. Playing volleyball at night, so I wanted to go somewhere to get serious to promote, and went to back to eights, and studied, made lieutenant. Finally made lieutenant in '96, and went to twos.
Went to Station 2?
Yep.
What shift?
I was on C shift then. Ronnie Stapleton was the driver. Again, great guy, great driver. I had M.R. Self as one of my firefighters, and Laura Parent. We were actually also, at that time that I was there, we were the experimental station for the first squad program. So that's when they moved, when we got the 75-foot Quints, they moved one of those out to twos, and then we got a brush truck that was considered a squad. And Ray Richardson moved out there. And eventually, when Ronnie retired, Whitey Smith moved out there as the driver. But we were the first squad program back then, running the Quint and then the squad.
How did that squad program run?
It worked exactly like, so me, Randy Smelson, I think it was David Stapp were the lieutenants there. And we were, with Chief Bronner, we worked out, or helped them work out, what the goals were going to be by doing that. So the goals were, I'm going to paraphrase because I can't remember them exactly, but I think it was to catch 10% of the calls that normally would have been assigned to either Engine 5 or Engine 6 when Engine 2 was out on a call, or Quint 2 was out on a call. And I think we ended up crunching the data. We were catching 20-25% of the calls with the squad. And the problem was that was a new era, right? Putting two firefighters on a truck without any quote unquote supervision was just a new era for the department. And even though we were meeting the goals, they just abolished the program. It wasn't the direction they wanted to go. So the Quint ended up, I think it was 6 or 9 months. The Quint ended up going to 2 or to 1s. We got an engine back. The brush truck went away, and we went back down to, we kept the 5 staffing, but we were only 3 on the engine. Or I'm sorry, no, we were 4 on the engine back at that time. But yeah, early days of the squad program, and it worked even back then. It worked. So
whenever y'all were in that Quint, did you operate it like a truck company, or did you operate it like an engine, or a little bit of both?
We did a little bit of both. Obviously, we were more of an engine company just because back then a lot of the fires were happening in 1s and 2s. So, we'd act like an engine company. But that truck was, our Quint was never assigned by itself as a ladder truck. We always had either 6s or 1s coming in also. So we never did act like a ladder truck. Nope.
And then you spent how many years at Station 2 as a
I
lieutenant?
was 4 years at Station 2 from 96 until 2000, and I made captain in 2000. It was early 2000. And I went back to 8 as a TRT guy. That was when the TRT team was not new, but it was just getting going good. I went there. Dave McMullen was a lieutenant. A guy by the name of Corey Bearden, who since left, was there. Um, Joe McKenzie, bunch of great guys, had a bunch of great guys. But I was only a captain like 6 months, and I made chief in October of 2000. And Chief Paulsgrove's the one that promoted me to battalion chief. I had put in for battalion chief before that, but didn't get promoted, and called me in the office one day. I actually got moved from 8s as a captain. I got moved to out of class battalion chief at 1s right before that. I don't remember why. I don't remember who left or what it was, but and then Paulsgrove called me in one day and said, I got good news and I got bad news. Good news is you're going to make battalion chief. Bad news is you're going to EMS or Med Ops at the time. It was like, okay, yeah, I'm in for that. 20 years of being 24-48, and then all of a sudden going 8 to 5 was a little bit of a shock. But I knew that with my EMS background, you know, at that time I was a flight paramedic for Care Flight still, you know, I interjected myself into teaching EMT school and all that stuff. So I knew that I was probably destined for that. The good news is with my ADD, that was about the time we were going to, we were doing EMTI school. So everybody was being bumped up to the EMTI level. Chief Holloway was the chief that before me. So he stayed there also because we had the ambulance contract coming up. It was the first big ambulance contract. Rural Metro was going out the door, Lifestar Rural Metro, and we eventually ended up picking the AMR, who we still have today. But the contract was new for anything that Arlington had liquidated damages, a bunch of restrictions that we hadn't had before. So it was a pretty intense time. So we were managing EMTI school. We were trying to figure out, you know, what we needed to do protocols wise for these new EMTs eyes that were in the street, intubating people, giving epi, all that stuff. Why making sure we got everybody trained and everybody passed. And then, oh yeah, by the way, this new ambulance contract that was going to be totally different, you know, minimum amount of ambulances on the street at a time, and a big deal. So it was a busy time, but it was a good time. I was going to say something else poignant about that. Yeah. So one of the other things I'm really proud of while I was in that position was right before 9/11, Mayor Cluck at the time, who was a doctor, was really big on starting a PAD program. PAD programs were big back then, public access defibrillation. And so the mayor had approached Chief Paulsgrove about the fire department starting a PAD program with city buildings. So Paulsgrove would come to me, or through Chief Riley, because Chief Riley was my assistant chief, said, hey, listen, you know, you got $15,000. We need to decide how to do this PAD program deal with city buildings. No problem. Great. I can do that. That's relatively easy. Well, 9/11 hit. So the money kind of went away, not for any other reason, but the city was kind of scared, like everybody was, of what was going on, what was going to happen. Held the money all tight to the vest. And I went into Paulsgrove one day after 9/11, and I said, listen, what are we going to do about this PAD program deal? He said, well, you can still do it, but you got to figure out how to do it on your own, or monies, or, you know, whatever. So long story short, very long story short, ended up having a meeting with all the different directors from the other city departments, water, convention center, and said, listen, you know, the mayor wants us to do this. Obviously, we've came on hard times, or what was perceived as hard times. Does anybody have any discretionary funds where we could put these AEDs in all the buildings? And I think I had 15 different city departments come up and go, yeah, we'll do, this is important, we'll do it. So we ended up still being able to do it. Convention Center was the big one. We put several of them through there. And then we had with the help of Brian Erickson, who was the clinical coordinator back then, put together a CPR program and a PAD program for city employees. So we did that. man, I want to say it was several times a month at the Parks Department, and we got a real good showing of that. I think at one time we were really, really close to training all the city employees on CPR and using of an AED, and that program is developed now. I don't know how many units there are in the system now, but that was just something that was given to me that I was proud of being able to do. That's now carried on and is a lot bigger. I want to say somebody told me not too long ago there's like 400 AEDs, churches, obviously the private sector too. But it was just a big project that I was given that I was proud to say I was part of.
Mm-hmm.
So.
How about there whenever AMR took over the ambulance service? How was that transition?
Yeah, it was good. The good news is that AMR's corporate headquarters were in Dallas at the time, so we had a lot of support from them. They were really Arlington was a big deal. Obviously, Arlington, even though we never see the exact numbers, Arlington was a moneymaker for whoever was running the ambulance business. Probably no matter what they told you, it was a moneymaker. So we knew it was going to be a big deal. AMR's corporate was whatever you guys want, we're going to give it to you. As far as the equipment, we even had a team. They put together a team. The original ambulances that had the big red QRS complex on the side of them, that was part of a mix of AMR guys and AFD guys developing that paint scheme. Lonnie Ballinger was on that, and that one obviously held true until their most recent ambulance purchase. But it was just before it was private contractor, fire department. This felt more like a family. That's when we started calling it Arlington EMS System, so it was all under one umbrella. The chief under the city ordinance was more responsible for their success, liquidated damages, the protocols, the medical director, and we just kicked it up to the next level. We were doing System CE together. That's when System CE came about. Before, we just kind of did our own thing, and never the two should meet in the middle. But it was just a big time and big endeavor in the Arlington Fire Department whenever that happened. And they were a good partner. I guess they still are. They're still here. But I know that there were some challenges during COVID, but COVID were different times. But yeah, it was just a big deal.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of all your stations that you worked at, what was your favorite station that you worked at?
I still love ones. I migrated. So when I came out of MedOps in 2002, and that was kind of a surprise too. Obviously the whole 8 to 5 deal was this 2-year thing. They'd always say 2 years, but I was on such a roll doing the PAD program, again, finishing up and all that stuff. I wasn't necessarily ready to leave. And one day Chief Riley called me into his office and said, it's time for you to leave. And I thought, oh shit. In fact, I asked him, what did I do wrong? He said, you didn't do anything wrong. He said, you guys, between you and Jeff, you guys just been really busy, and it's time for somebody else to take over. And no, you know what? David Stapp took over after me. I don't think Jim Self did, and it was David Stapp. But and he said, you're going out to a station. And about that time, Bob Bennett retired. Bob went to the National Fire Academy to run that program for a while, but I took his slot at 1. So I was back at 1s again as Battalion 1. And I stayed there from 2002 until the year they made the 505s. And for some reason, I can't remember that year. And I was told I was going to 505 by Jim, and I didn't want to. Wanted to stay at 1s, finish out my career. But yeah, back at 1s again for a while. Had a good time. Ray Richardson had always told me that because I worked with him at 2s and worked with him at 8s, and Ray and I were real good friends. He had a strong EMS background, but Ray said, if I ever get a chance to drive for you, I'd like to do that. So when I found out I was leaving, I called Ray and said, hey, you want to drive for me? And he said, hell yeah. And Ray and I were attached at the hip for many years at 1. A lot of the pictures nowadays and the videos are attributed to Ray, because Ray would always slap that video camera on top of the hood of the Suburban and throw a radio up there and just let the video run. And he'd snap a lot of pictures. Man, I don't know how the guy did it, but I could always come back to the Suburban from doing a walk around, and Ray'd be snapping pictures, running the video camera, and still have the board all caught up where everybody's at. Where's truck 1? Oh, you assigned him to this. Okay, but the guy was just great, and that's why we spent so many years together.
What would you say the benefit of all those pictures and videos are?
They're now, obviously, right? And again, you and I have done a lot of talking about all the old apparatus pictures and stuff. That's just, people don't realize how important that is. And even today, with me retiring, being able to go back and look at all my pictures, it's just gold. And I know the kids nowadays don't get off on that as much, but someday they will when they retire and be able to go back and look at all that stuff. Again, not everybody's into fire trucks and looking back at those and remembering all the dates of when we bought them and how much and where it went and what assignment it was. But I've always gotten off on that. I mean, and now it's helping, right? You're working on the history of AFD apparatus and AFD in general for new Fire Station 1. Shit's important. It really is important, keeping that up. And the old guys, Steve Pruitt was big into it. He taught the history class to all the recruit schools. And then Ray was really into it. Ray spent countless hours as the tech of Battalion 1 scanning all those old pictures, going to UTA, finding newspaper articles. He bought his own scanner. He was taking slides, and he had a scanner that converted slides to digital pictures. And now you're the benefit of that thumb drive or that drive that has all that crap on there. And that's just a labor of love, again, that not a lot of people nowadays probably care about, but it's a big deal. It's a big deal.
Absolutely. So speaking of talking about your career in general, what were some of the most notable fires that you remember?
I was on 2 of and it wasn't even in Arlington. They were the Grand Prairie, that place that keeps burning, that big place in Grand Prairie. Yep, that plastics place. I was on a couple of those, obviously. Man, I didn't have a whole lot of big fires. They were just, we were, in that stint when I became Battalion 1, it was almost like the mid-'80s when we had a whole bunch of fires at once. And I'm going to back up a minute and then I'll answer your question, but you've heard the old stories about Doug Baker developed the little stencil that we put on the inside of our coats it had a flame with a circle in the middle, and we either put a 1, 2, or 3, or 4, depending on how many alarms it was. And we had our coats filled with those, but we were busy back then. And that's kind of the way it was with Battalion 1, not big 5-alarm deals, but just a whole bunch of 1 and 2, 3-alarm working fires that were just good fires. The guys put a good stop on, everybody came home, and it was just good, solid, doing our job. So, man, I can't remember any of the just big ones. They were just, again, apartment fires, that type stuff. There's a picture of me in front of that Mexican food restaurant that was on Division, right there to the west of Fielder, where it's me silhouetted with that Mexican food restaurant, like fully involved. That was a big fire that night, and that's how we actually all of us pulled up about the same time, and that's how that place was going, how much it was going back then. We didn't mess that up and it got that far. That's literally, I got out of the Suburban, was given orders, and Ray snapped that picture. But that's a picture that I still have on all my stuff back home too. But,
What about just calls in general? Are there any other calls that you just remember?
Yeah, I was, some of them, I was on the Amtrak, one of the Amtrak train derailments. I was actually lieutenant at 2s that night. One of the things why that sticks out to me is obviously it was a big deal. That poor train had hit a pedestrian in Mesquite and was stopped for over 4 hours in Mesquite, and then came into Arlington and derailed. It was a foggy night. We got the call as of a train derailment somewhere around GM type deal, and we're all going that way, and it's foggy, we can't see, and all of a sudden we see this Amtrak train on its side. But one of the things that's significant about that is Battalion Chief Roy Brazier was the battalion chief over that and the incident commander. And man, I looked up to Roy. Was one of those guys. Him and Chief Bill Shanklin were 2 that really molded me, and and John Murphy, who I looked at, how they did things when they were chiefs, and I kind of molded the way I did it after them. Calm, cool, never got in an uproar about stuff, clear, concise communication, making sure everybody understood what they needed to do. And so that night, Roy made me staging officer, and I'm going, I'm a lieutenant. I'm going, oh shit, I've never done this before. I got to think in my book. Okay, I got to do this. And but after the fact, Roy came up to me and told me I did a great job. He corrected me on a couple of things, but he told me I did a great job. And as far as my career, that was the first time that I just really felt good about being a company officer, that I'd done something different, that somebody put me in that position because they believed in me, and then after the fact told me I did a good job, and that just felt good. I don't know why that stuck out in my head, but it just did.
Mm-hmm.
It just did.
Speaking more of like being a company officer, we have a lot of people obviously new in their roles because of kind of how Arlington boomed in the '80s,
Mm-hmm.
and all those guys have retired. Well, all the people that have taken their place were all kind of new to our roles.
Yep.
What sort of advice would you give those new company officers to strive to become, or some characteristics to have?
Man, I think the biggest thing is obviously Arlington's been um, in kind of turmoil for several different reasons. One of them is the sucking sound that was the uh, 80s experience leaving the building. And that did throw this department into a quandary. I like to think that we left those guys in good positions, but even beyond that, I'm seeing guys now that are captains that were firefighters back then and probably didn't really have the ability, or at the time, to be immersed by Jeff Holloway and me and Jerry Brooks. And so, I look back at, how they got their experience. Where did they draw from? But, the only thing I can tell them is that there's more about firefighting than Arlington. You got to get out of Arlington. And that's something that this department's always had a hard time doing, is realizing that there's other people around doing the same job that might have a better idea. I didn't go to the fire academy until way late in my career, and that was a big mistake. The fire academy was just an outstanding um, uh, avenue to meet different people, to learn different things that was different than the way Arlington did things. And the other thing about it too is that once you get promoted, that, and I know they know this, but that learning and going out and getting new information and learning new things didn't stop. You gotta be hungry for that. Stuff's changing all the time. I mean, this now, it's so funny to see guys talk about nozzle forward and the different nozzles and their gallonages. Now we just don't have inch and a half hose. We have inch and whatever with different linings, because you get 10 more gallons per minute out of it, and smooth bores coming back and all that. There's just so much more information to learn about that in order to keep you safe and to keep your crew safe. It's just crazy, but you got to get out of this pond. Arlington is not the only thing around. I mean, it's just not.
Mm-hmm.
So,
What about, speaking of sort of trainings? What were some of the more favorite trainings that y'all did that you remember?
training,
Mm-hmm.
I liked battalion drills. I really did, and even as a battalion chief, because they were normally on the weekend where you didn't have to jack with anything else. But I think that was more of a personal than trying to do something at training where everybody went through training to do it. That always ended up being so, just depending on what instructor you got. Well, I got this information. Well, hell, they didn't tell me anything about that. So even though we still struggled with battalion drills of consistency, I think that those were more the personal drills, and you taking, especially as a battalion chief or as a captain, you taking responsibility for your little part of the world, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Speaking of kind of like whenever you were early on in your career, what were some of the fire tactics like, and how did they change over the years?
You know, um, I'm not sure I'm not sure they really changed. Obviously, the equipment changed, but you still got to get inside, and you still got to put the wet stuff on the red stuff. Obviously, the equipment's changed. Nozzles have changed, like I said before. Air packs have definitely changed from what we had before. The equipment's changed. The fire trucks have changed. Their capacity has changed. But it was still just flat out tactics. Obviously, back then we weren't unsafe, but we didn't have as much of the emphasis on safety. Let me give one example of that. It was accountability. We didn't have any accountability back then as far as a system. Everybody was accountable. We didn't have a system. And by the grace of God, we didn't lose anybody because of that. But it was a little more just down and dirty, getting in there and fighting the fire and not worrying about making sure you left your par tags or, whatever that is nowadays, but it was still fun.
Oh, yeah. I know you're big into apparatus, like you said.
Yep.
What kind of drew you to that? What drew you to the apparatus?
So my dad was a diesel mechanic by trade, so I was always around trucks. On Saturdays, I'd beg him to take me to the shop if he was going. He ran Colorado Freightliner in Denver, and then how we got to Texas was he got transferred down here because he ran Fort Worth Freightliner for a long time. But I was always around fire trucks, or trucks in general, not fire trucks. I was always around big 18-wheelers and just always enjoyed being around them. Enjoyed watching Dad work on them, watch all of his guys work on them, and just really enjoyed that. So obviously when I transitioned into the fire service, trucks were a part of that, right? I always enjoyed brand new fire trucks. And when I came to Arlington, we had such a wide array of different, obviously American LaFrance back then, and we had a wide array of trucks. And back then, if you had American LaFrances, you were the shit. I mean, you were something. And we did. We had a bunch of them. The very first one I was on at Station 1 was the 78 LaFrance. It had an old inline 671 engine in it, and the sound it made when you were riding backwards, I mean, I can still remember it, and that was cool. Everybody remembers that if you've ever rode one of those trucks. But that transitioned into 1994. Chief Shanklin, I'd put in for the apparatus committee. Don Gibson was already on there. Neil Strasser was on there. I can't remember who else was on there, but there was a slot come open. I put in for it, and Chief Shanklin selected me. So the first trucks that I had anything to do with, I didn't have anything to do with the design, and some of the older people will go, well, he's just making sure everybody knows, because those were kind of not a disaster, but I came in at the end when we went and did final inspection on the 94 KMEs. So, and then when Paulsgrove got a whole bunch of money in 1998, we decided to change over the fleet. Obviously, I was a part of that, and part of where that came from was, again, we had a wide array of trucks. All of them, all the pumpers looked differently. Things were in a different place. And we started to have some guys that were taking the apparatus operators test complain that their engine was different than Joe Bob. So, like the Alley Dock was the big one. Some of the engines were longer than the LaFrances. The LaFrances were little sports cars. They could whip in and out. Well, some of the guys, and they were right, were complaining that their trucks were longer. They were at a disadvantage. So the committee decided when Paulsgrove got that big lump of money that we were going to change over the fleet. We were going to be consistent with how everything looked, so we wouldn't have that problem anymore. Plus, it would just help on the fire ground, right? Go to the left rear, or go get the Halligan. Everybody knew where the Halligan was, or whatever it was. So in 1998, we bought 3 engines and the 3 75-foot aerials. And they were the Freightliners, which were a mistake because of so much problem that we had with the Freightliners. But that's from the pump box, or from the back of the cab back. That pump box, that body stayed that way for a long, long time. In fact, the pump box is almost identical. I was just down at training teaching 17s and 15s on their new engine today, the last 2 days, and I'll do it tomorrow. But Arlington still has in their specifications that those crosslays will be no taller than 60 inches off the ground, and that's a big deal. It doesn't matter whether you're a height challenged or not. They're easier to pull when they're lower on the truck. So that stuff has held true since 1998. So now fast forward to today, they look a little bit different, real close, but again, overall lengthwise, their maneuverability, they're the same, and that was the goal. But I just love new fire trucks. I mean, I've always loved it. I love being involved in it. When I made battalion chiefs, we had certain things that we were responsible for. One of them was fire apparatus. So I became kind of under Chief Murphy. I was kind of the committee chair over that. And for a long time, my now boss in my next career wanted to hire me. And I always told him I couldn't because it was a conflict of interest because I was over the committee, and he understood that. But then I got taken off of apparatus and got put over radios and MDCs, which I had a long career doing that, and started doing that part-time because I still enjoy making specs. I love building fire trucks. I love delivering them, especially to underprivileged volunteer fire departments that may not get one once every 40 years or whatever. It's still great to pull in with that new truck. And then it's led into my second career, which is a great career of doing that same thing, dealing with firemen, being around firemen, and being around new fire trucks.
Oh yeah.
So it's fun.
You mentioned the crosslays being 60 inches.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever in '98, when we bought all them trucks, is that whenever we went to the what's now known as the Arlington load, our pre-connected hose loads?
Yeah, I believe so. That's taken a couple of different morphs. I never was a hose guy or on the hose committee or coming up with that. It didn't matter to me as long as I could pull it off the truck. That's all I cared about. And as a chief, I never pulled hose off the truck. But those crosslays have been through several different morphs as far as how you pull them off. But again, the goal was to make them reachable, no matter what hose load was in there, and we've done that since 1998.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's cool. Speaking about you mentioned a lot of names in the stations that you worked through, and some of the chiefs that you really looked up to. But who would you say mentored you the most throughout your career?
I actually, there's obviously several, but if I had to pick one, it was probably Bill Shanklin. And not so much that he was directly involved with it, but you'd watch him do his job, and that's how you got, and I'm positive, even though I didn't directly mentor people during my stint as a chief, every day, believe me, I thought there are people watching me, and they're watching what I do, whether it's good or bad, and they're going to remember that. And that's how it was with Chief Shanklin. I got a little more of a story with Chief Shanklin that I didn't tell when I was talking about at the beginning about hiring on. So one of the other things that happened to me about hiring on was once I finally got to where October of '81 was coming up, second class, they sent us to go do our physicals, and they picked up on me that I had spondylosis in my back. And the doctor at the dog and cat clinic over there on East Division actually put me down to suggest not to hire me. So when I got that call, obviously, I'd about had it with Arlington, or not literally, but it was getting kind of depressing. I was having to work too hard for this job. And I actually called up to admin one day and I said, listen, what do I got to do? I've been a paramedic now for 2 or 3 years, lifting patients. I've never had a problem with my back. And they said, well, you need to come in and talk to Chief Shanklin. Again, what I told you before, Chief Shanklin was acting assistant chief operations when Chief Martin left. And I can remember to this day in fact, it was the Voodoo Lounge at Ones before the old Ones went away. That was Chief Shanklin's office. And walked in the front door, and Chief Shanklin was in there, and I just told him, I said, listen, this is not right. I'm perfectly fine. I've been a paramedic. I'm lifting patients in an ambulance, and I don't have any problems. And obviously I was quite upset as a 19-year-old that was trying to get a job in the career he loved. And Chief Shanklin said, hold on a minute. And I don't know who he called. It was somebody in the city, probably somebody in human resources. But he asked him, can this guy get a second opinion? And whoever it was on the other side of the phone said yes. So I took off, and I found a orthopedic surgeon in Euless that I called and said, can I get in? And I told him what this doctor had said about me. Long story short, doctor wrote out a report saying, and I still have that report in all my memorabilia, that he does have mild spondylosis, which is consistent with 90% of the Americans in the U.S., and that he shouldn't have any trouble doing that job. Long story short, that's how I got hired. So I got a little bit more of a warm spot in my heart for Chief Shanklin because of that. But then watching him over the years and how he handled himself, and everybody always commented about, I never really saw Chief Shanklin eat anybody's ass out, but with his eyes, he could eat your ass out, and you knew you got your ass ate out when he looked at you, the way he said something to you. But it was just that guy. Chief Roy was Roy Brazier was tactically a solid guy. Things from him. Chief Bronner was that calm, tactically sound guy. Took things from him, and so just a bunch of them.
Mm-hmm. What about the younger guys? Did you learn anything from the younger generations that as you hit your 20 years, you were looking back at kind of the newer guys coming onto the department?
Yeah, I did. Obviously, there was a big difference between me as a 19-year-old and some of the 19-year-olds that we hired on as I left. But one interesting thing, and I'll take a sidetrack and I'll get back to that, but one of the interesting things in my career I went from being around a whole bunch of Vietnam vets, Benny Hilliard, John McQuarrie, Paul Brewer, all of those guys that came from a place that I had, we see it on TV, but I really had no idea what they went through. It was a blast being around them, to listen to them when they would talk, because a lot of those guys were really shut down about that, which I understand, but just great guys. And then we went through not having any of those Vietnam vets. And then we got the Anthony Trujillos and Wassermans, who were badasses in Iraq and Afghanistan and all those places. So part of what I learned from those younger guys, Trujillo and all those guys, is that they weren't necessarily that different from me when I was young. They took a different course, but they were badasses. They were great guys personally, and they were just a blast to be around. Now, obviously later on in my career, before I left, we got some guys that have now promoted and turned out to be great guys, but they were, and not that they weren't great guys when they first hired on, but they were just younger. They didn't have the experiences that we had, not only in firefighting, but everything else, I'll never forget, De La Sega was sitting at the table right before I retired, and Kevin Leverett was asking me about when I hired on, just download me before I retired. And I could see De La Sega just hired on, and he came from the ISD program, right? So I could see him sitting over there, and he was looking around or whatever, and all of a sudden he said, "Chief, my mom was 8 years old when you hired on." And that just, that put it all in perspective for me, that he wasn't even thought of when I hired on, like literally not even thought of when I hired on. But that was a funny story. But, everybody's got their pluses and minuses. Again, it's all in how the leaders mold them and make sure they understand what their job is, and how they fit into the system, and that they've got to do the job, and everybody's got to go home at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. What about thinking back from the start to finish? What was one of the biggest changes in the department in your career?
I think the biggest thing was EMS, and again, I was always involved in that, so that's why that sticks out to me. We went from not even taking a swipe at EMS to where we are today. And that was probably the biggest changes. We didn't have hardly anything on the trucks to be able to help somebody. And I can remember one of the very first calls I made after being assigned to ones was at Sanford and Cooper. It was Cooper used to make a little bit more of a jog, and right there on the right past Sanford on the east side of the road, there was this huge oak tree that had been there forever. And some kids went around that curve, lost control, and hit that oak tree. And this car was just wrapped around that oak tree. And I can remember getting there it was me, Coker, and Bob Franklin, and we pulled up there, and I've never felt more helpless in all my life as a paramedic. I mean, and that's back when mid-cities, and they maybe had 4 ambulances on the street, so it took a little while for the ambulance to get there. But we have just come so far now of what these guys are able to do. And obviously there's further to go, right?
Mm-hmm.
As far as how far we can take this EMS system, we'll see what the new leadership holds for that. But that's probably the biggest deal is EMS.
Mm-hmm. And kind of speaking towards new leadership, I know you're still very in touch with that happens at the department.
Yep.
Um, what sort of advice would you just give people as we bring on a new chief from wherever he may be from? What sort of advice would you give us?
Well, I think you got to give the guy, whoever that is, obviously a chance. I would hope that, and I feel like the guys, I know two of the guys personally, probably um, probably two of the guys that are maybe up higher on the list for everybody, but they obviously come from great organizations, and I would hope that when they come in that they would go around and listen to everybody, tell them what's wrong with the organization, right from down from we can't get enough drinking glasses in the kitchen to whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. My circle or my frame of reference for that is what Paulsgrove did when he came in. Paulsgrove went around to all the stations, gathered several stations up together, and just gave a spiel. I'm Robin Paulsgrove. I was an Austin guy for 20 years. Here's what I believe in. What's wrong with the AFD? And he put his legal pad out and started writing. A lot of guys can't get enough drinking glasses. Other guys was, my deal at that time is that I had just made lieutenant, but the day I made driver to the day I made lieutenant, I didn't get any special training to be a lieutenant. They just blessed me with it.
Mm-hmm.
So I was a big officer development. What are we going to do about that? But I would hope that new guy goes around and does that. And there's going to be changes. I mean, what do firemen don't like? They don't like change. They don't like the way things are. So everybody get ready to hold on, because any of those guys that are currently on the short list come from departments that do things differently than Arlington does. And there's probably going to be some change, and some of it's going to be for the good, and some of it's not going to be for the good. But again, going back to Chief Paulsgrove, whenever we went to EMTI school, that was a big deal, especially for some of the older guys. They felt threatened by having to be EMTIs, but Paulsgrove did a real good job of explaining to everybody why this was important. And I think for the most part, everybody understood being explained. He didn't explain it from up there with a memo. We had several different deals at training where he explained it to everybody, and everybody was allowed to come out there. So that's what I hope for the new chief, whoever that is, that change is going to come, but it's all in how you feed it to people on how they embrace it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, kind of thinking back, what sort of advice would you give your younger self, the 19-year-old that started on with AFD? What advice would you give him?
I was probably too big for my britches back when I hired on. I don't have any. I can't point to anything that tells me that. I didn't ever get in trouble or get dressed down by anybody. I've always had a lot of confidence, and I normally don't do things offhand if I don't know that I'm confident in being able to get that done or whatever. But I think my younger self was probably a little overconfident and probably came across that way with some people, and probably turned people off because of that. And that's my fault, not theirs. I'm accountable for that. But the other thing is, especially what we talked about earlier about now going back and looking at pictures and stuff. I wish I'd have taken more pictures just of crews, just of us doing goofy ass stuff, playing volleyball. I can't find any pictures of us playing volleyball behind nines, but we had a freaking blast. We got pissed off at each other. There were almost fights, but we just had a blast, and we were a closer knit crew because of that. And it's not just volleyball, it's not playing basketball, it's not ping pong, but just some of the stuff that we all did together. I wish I'd had more pictures of that in station life and all the guys and everything, because we tell this funny story, and I hope Pivato's listening because they'll remember it. But at Nines one day, we were all out putting Christmas lights on Old Station 9, and David Pivato, God love him, and I do, He was being a fuddy-duddy about it. He was sitting inside. We don't need Christmas lights on the station or whatever. So finally, Captain Pittman went in there and said, "Get your ass out there and be part of the crew and Christmas lights." So he came outside, and Christmas lights were strung all over. We were trying to figure out how to put them on the station. And he said, "What do you guys need me to do?" And Scott Bailey or somebody said, "Put a new end on that. Cut the end off that Christmas light string and put a new end on there." Well, Scott didn't tell him it was plugged in. So when David went up to go cut the end of that end off, it sparked and put an arc in the cutters, and Pivotal threw him down the ground and said, "Fuck me all," went back into the station and sat there. But we laughed about that. Oh my God, we weren't trying to kill him. It was just one of those deals. But we laughed about that, and I just wish we'd have had pictures, or nowadays video is a big deal of just the fun about that. And again, we laughed as a crew forever about that. We just did.
Mm-hmm.
It's fun. We almost killed him, but it was fun.
Makes for a good story.
Right.
What would you say is one of the most difficult things about being a firefighter?
You know, nowadays, I'll go nowadays and I'll relate back, but I can't even imagine what you guys had to go through during COVID. I'm so glad I retired. So glad I retired. Obviously, still connected to a bunch of firemen. So I knew what you guys were going through. I heard what you guys were going through. Would not want to be there, dude. Just would not want to be there. And damn sure wouldn't want to be there in an administrative position trying to figure that all out. So I think nowadays you guys got to deal with a lot more politics than we had to deal with back in the day. Obviously, that's what a fire chief is for, is to keep the politics off. You know, I always told all of my crews, we dictate what happens in our fire station every shift, not nobody else. Obviously, policy does, you know, doing the right thing, but we can't get messed up over the politics. We got to focus on what we're doing before somebody gets hurt. So I think nowadays you guys really have a lot of politics and a lot of BS to deal with that we didn't have to back in the day. We were really, number one, it wasn't around. Number two, we were really filtered from it. You know, it didn't affect our job as much as it could or does nowadays with you guys. So,
mm-hmm. What about what would you say some important characteristics of a good firefighter are?
You know, again, keeping yourself, I say this all the time, of keeping yourself physically fit. We're dying of our conditioning and we're dying of cancer. That's what we're dying of, still to this day. So keeping yourself in good condition, which a lot of guys do. I hate, you know, it was even happening before I left, and this isn't I'm not trying to, but the amount of energy drinks people consume during the day is not good for us, right? And making sure that you watch what you're doing as far as everything you can do as far as cancer prevention. Those are big deals. On top of that, again, getting out of Arlington, tactics, new tactics, building construction's always going to be big. I drove around today. I had a little extra time waiting on us to do this interview and drove around. Some of these buildings are unbelievable. They're building around UTA, and hell, new Fire Station 1's got a bunch of different construction methods to it, stuff hanging off of it and all that stuff you need to be aware of. But you just got to stay in tune with what's going on. You got to keep yourself healthy, stay in tune with what's going on. There's a light at the end of the tunnel, and TMRS is great. You know, I tell people all the time, I told a rather experienced firefighter that is not promoted real recently, you got to think of the end. You got to think of the end. That's not the only reason to promote and be better is TMRS, but it makes a big difference when you get to retirement on whether or not you have to have another job or you don't have to. I don't have to work another job. I choose to, you know, but that would be my recommendation for guys. And take pictures.
Take pictures? Oh, yeah. I love me some pictures.
Yep.
What do you miss most about being an Army?
I miss the guys.
Yeah.
Still me being involved with it on the apparatus side, you know, like today I was down there again training the guys down there on their new engine, but I just miss the guys. That's all there is. I miss the station. I'll miss the BS. You know, in my position as 505, I was obviously, you know, I got everything from every side. I never could win, and I just miss the guys. I miss the job. I miss going out on a run. I'm going to go ride out with ones when they move into the new station one night and just, you know, experience that out of the new station and stuff. But yeah, it's the guys, and I think that's what every retiree will tell you. Don't miss the circus, you know. They miss the clowns.
Oh yeah.
Yep.
Common phrase.
Yep.
But looking back on your career, would you do it all over again?
Absolutely.
Would you change anything?
You know, again, I would. You know, I can't pinpoint that exactly. I beat myself up over staying driver so long, and I don't know why that's important. There's plenty of guys that have been a driver a long time. There's nothing wrong with that. I just got so much more fulfillment once I started promoting to company officers. I liked doing that job. I think I did a good job. I just liked that part of the job, and then making it way up to chief. I just liked it. I liked what went on with that. So I probably beat myself up a little bit about staying driver so long, but damn, that was a good job too, driving a fire truck. It just was.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was.
Do you have any other stories or any other advice that you'd like to share?
Man, I got so many stories. Some of them the statute of limitations aren't up, but so I'll stay away from those. But it was a great job. The Arlington Fire Department, you know, going back to your question previously, not trying to avoid the next question, but if I had it to do all over again and I knew what my career was going to be like in Arlington, I actually got called by Fort Worth 2 weeks after finally getting on here to come to work over there. I wouldn't have changed that. I wouldn't have went to Fort Worth if I went back and had a chance, or I wouldn't have went to Carrollton, wouldn't have went to Plano. I like exactly what happened here. I like what we did here when we were at our peak as far as staffing and everything else. We were, and still are, an outstanding fire department. This department has always done great work. This department does more as far as special events, you know, everything than any other department in the Metroplex. It just does. And I know everybody gets caught up in the minutia of what that looks like, but everybody that I deal with in my other life outside recognizes that Arlington firemen are busy. They're busy call-wise, they're busy doing other things-wise, and everybody notices that. Mm-hmm. So that's a big positive.
Awesome. Well, yep. If not anything else, I just want to thank you for your time.
No, thanks, Luke, for what you're doing. I hope everybody realizes what you're doing for history and apparatus and everything else. It's a big deal, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
I'm sure if anybody has any follow-up questions or anything, they can find you.
They can find me. People know where to find me.
Yes, sir.
All right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.